Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our weekly Wednesday webinar with the Property Law Alliance. And then thank you so much for joining me, Silna and Bruno. And Bruno, how are you doing this evening?
I'm very well, thank you. I could do with a bit of sleep and a glass of whiskey, but overall, not too bad.
I'm glad to hear that. Silna, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. I don't need whiskey. I'm sorry, Bruno, that you do. It's because you're not in your place with the whiskey behind you. But no,
I've got
I'm
whiskey
doing.
in front of me.
So take a whiskey. We can even pause for like 2 seconds so you can pour yourself a whiskey.
If the screen goes blank and the video's off, you know what I'm doing.
And if you then suddenly start answering either amazingly or a little incoherently, we'll know.
Yeah, fair enough.
Perfect. All right. Then thank you for all our viewers. I think we can get started. The first one, which I want you guys to discuss, is quite interesting and something different. Can you sell a property for cryptocurrency? So I think, Silna, if you maybe want to get started on this one.
Now I understand why Bruno needs a whiskey. Even me, at least I've got like pink water. And Bruno, I think this is actually a very good discussion to have. So the rules around sale of anything, but specifically property, is that you obviously need to be able to show that you are paying for it. So it's not just a donation, which we can do, but then there's going to be donation tax involved, which is fine. It can be done. It's not illegal. It's just a tax implication. So to sell an immovable property for cryptocurrency, I understand it does make sense, and I do understand why it's coming up, because as much as we see property entrepreneurs, very often your property entrepreneurs are also into cryptocurrency. It's a standard thing that we see often. So I can see why this question would come up, and I can see why it's relevant. And my answer would be, yes, definitely, but you shouldn't just do like a standard issue OTP to say like X amount of Bitcoin for the property. That is going to cause a problem, because remember, how do you pay that? For instance, you need to deal with things in terms of an OTP where we're dealing with rands or any other actual currency. The money physically goes from the one bank account into the attorney's trust account up to the point of transfer, and then gets paid to the seller. Where when it comes to cryptocurrency, how would that transaction work? I'm not saying it's not doable. I'm saying that OTP has to be very specific, because the truth is, the last thing that you want is that you transfer property and eventually the parties agreed that they're going to pay by Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency they're using, and then transfer takes place and the actual currency isn't transferred. And the problem that I see with that is, it's amazing, and I've said this a million times on this particular webinar as well, is that we do have an issue that our law is sort of here in 19 foot sack, and then the actual world is here in 2020, or at least still stuck in 2019, but it's not in 19 foot sack. So our laws, and this is not a South African law comment that I'm making, this is an international law comment that I'm making, it doesn't keep up with the times. So there's a lot of regulations around actual money and how we collect money and how we deal with that. But there isn't legislation around cryptocurrency and use on cryptocurrency in a normal business sense, as we would see with anything else. So I must say that's a bit of a tricky one for me. Answer definitely yes, it can be done. You need to be clever on your OTP. That's not a DIY OTP that you're just gonna, buy from TPN or get from your kind conveyancer. And that's something that's it's going to take some effort to think about and really get to the correct answer. My other problem with this is Bruno SARS. So if it's obviously a transaction that would normally fall under transfer duty, and you can show to SARS that market value is under a transfer duty threshold, being $1 million at this stage, how you're going to have to motivate to SARS that the conversion from cryptocurrency to rands still fall under the transfer duty threshold. And I don't know how easily SARS will bite onto that one. So I must say, as long as you're under transfer duty threshold, happy with that. I do foresee problems as soon as market value is over $1 million on sale on cryptocurrency. Am I being conservative, or am I making a bit of sense?
That makes absolute sense. So yeah, it's just one of those things. So if you look at it from, so exactly what you said, for sale of a property, there has to be, for any sort of sale, there needs to be some form of consideration. So generally, there isn't any kind of prescribed form on what this consideration could be, and that's where the whole concept historically of bartering kind of came into the picture, where people used to swap one asset for another. And even to this day, we've got certain sections in the Income Tax Act that are very much aware of asset for share transfers and a whole range of things. So exchanges between parties is something that happens very, very often. With immovable property, you tend to find that this doesn't often happen because it's such a large transaction. It's not something that you very easily barter. Normally, there's also bonds associated. So you find that 90% of property transactions run through some form of banking institution. So the payment of cash in property transactions is usually unheard of. As attorneys, we do see it, but I mean, that's because we do it every day. And still there, it's maybe 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 50 where we see that. So now when it comes to the use of cryptocurrency, I love the idea, but exactly what Solna said. So first of all, everyone would be trying to value the cryptocurrency. So you would, especially SARS would want to know what the value is. And now the other risk that you face is there has been quite a bit of highs and lows when it comes to some cryptocurrencies recently. So you've got the more stable ones. I mean, even Bitcoin at a stage dropped tremendously, but even now it's reached some level of stability. It's not terribly stable, but it's there. But it also depends what cryptocurrency you use, because when you tie in the value on date of purchase versus when payment is supposed to be made, that's now a risk that you need to face. Either the value goes up tremendously or drops, and now you're liable to pay a purchase price that is higher than what you'd initially imagined, or the seller has the risk now of having to accept a purchase price that's lower. So that's another condition of the agreement that you guys might want to look into. Maybe tie it to the rand if you have to tie it, so that there is a rand value. If there's a rand value, SARS will want its piece of the pie. So they would definitely want to climb in here and try and get something out. The other thing that we need to remember is, from exchange control and fica perspective, cryptocurrency has proved challenging, because the whole point of not allowing for money laundering is that you could actually trace this money. So it's a very good question, because I mean, I'll actually write it down here to research a little bit further. But from the perspective, from a conveyancer's perspective, as an accountable institution, is this something that now needs to be reported? Because to a certain degree, there is a level of cash involved. It hasn't been disclosed, so it could be tantamount to money laundering. So there's a hell of a lot of questions surrounding this. And I can promise you right now, there aren't answers. And this is going to be something that's going to develop month after month, year after year. There's going to be case law. There's going to be change in legislation. Hell, we don't even know how Reserve Bank is going to react to cryptocurrency if it becomes more popular. So this is going to be ever changing. As far as I'm concerned, yes, you can do it, but there are going to be some hurdles that we need to jump over.
Bruno, just help me out. I'm really not well versed with cryptocurrency, simply because it's not something I'm personally involved with, and since our clients are property investors and not that often issues with cryptocurrency. Why would you rather use a cryptocurrency to buy a property rather than, at the moment, of having to pay the purchase price, not sell the cryptocurrency and actually buy the property in rands? What would be, do you have enough knowledge of cryptocurrency to answer that question, because I definitely don't. What would be the downside
Of
to
using rands.
selling your cryptocurrency and get it into rands and use rands? Because
No,
we're
fair
in
enough.
South Africa. It's for me, it's very similar to having an investment account with money you borrowed somewhere that you've put in the Caymans because you don't want the people you borrowed it from to know where it is. That would be silly to try and use that money in a different currency in South Africa. You would certainly bring that back in rands and then trade with that, unless the money you borrowed was stolen, and the moment you try to switch it back to rand, it's gonna be a problem. Isn't that exactly the reason why we want to trade in rands? Isn't that exactly the double safety measure, that you don't end up with, let's call it, dirty Bitcoin or dirty cryptocurrency, where if it has to go through a filter process back into rands, that you at least sit with clean, ready laundered money? That was an inappropriate joke. I'm just going to take a sip of water, but you catch my drift. I don't want to have somebody pay me with dirty money and then I'm stuck with the dirty laundry.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, I'm no expert either. I'm not going to claim to be, but so from my understanding of it, the one upside to cryptocurrency is, number one, there is a level of traceability, so you can trace certain steps along the way. So that's what makes it legitimate that it is going to reach your wallet. But the upside is that from a governmental exchange control perspective, Reserve Bank perspective, and specifically cross-border perspective, it's no one can access it. So the Reserve Bank will not be able to pick up that money was exchanged across borders, which it does have the upside, because now you can take money overseas, bring it back, and there'd be a little understanding or little knowledge of it. Although again, I stand to be corrected. This is just from a certain understanding that I have. I haven't exactly kept up to date with it, so I'm sure by now, certain mechanisms would have been put into place to try and stop things like that from happening, especially on a larger scale. What I think, and if I'm not mistaken, because this is some of the wallets work, there are certain fees that get levied once you actually do the exchange. And I mean, this happens across most of the platforms. If you look at share trading, ETF trading or tracking, your platform does charge you a specific fee. And if it's a small amount, it's generally negligible. But if you're looking at purchase prices for properties, it could be a bit high. So why exchange to rands, pay that cost? And as per your example, with international currency or foreign currency, when you do the exchange and bring it into rands, it's going to cost you money. It's going to cost you money. There's going to be certain hurdles to get money out of countries back into another country, and paid over as a purchase price. So this is kind of an easier way of saying, why don't we use the foreign currency to buy the property once off and no one asks any questions? Obviously, because of our registration system, our deeds office would pick up the actual transfer. So that would have to be dealt with from a transfer duty perspective and a SARS perspective, because they would be notified of this. So if there's any risk of something happening from a fraud perspective, buying properties is probably not the easiest way of trying to get away with it.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it's an interesting conversation. I wonder if any of our viewers are specifically well versed in cryptocurrency, and you do trade with cryptocurrency. I'm sorry, I'm just throwing out an invite now, but don't you please want to inbox us? Let's have a conversation, and maybe we can actually have a proper cryptocurrency conversation on a Wednesday webinar, because now that we actually started discussing the question, I realized there's actually so much more to it, and it could very well be the answer to many to many of our viewers problems.
Absolutely.
Definitely. All right. That's a very good idea. So, yeah, please inbox us. Then we can go to the next question. The right to appoint a transferring attorney. So, is it the seller's right or the purchaser's right, or what is the situation? Bruno?
Did you have time to pour whiskey yet for this one?
Oh man.
I'll sit back. I'll drink my water.
So this is a age-old question. It's all over the place. It's becoming very, very prominent now. I'm starting to see it creep up, especially because of the costs that purchasers are expected to pay. And with the purchaser paying cost, the purchaser feels entitled to appoint the conveyancer because ultimately it's their money that's being poured out. So it's and so long story short, if you look at it historically from its origin, there is case law. There's no question about this. There's case law, and I mean this is from the 1900s. I think it's somewhere around 1903, where the courts indicated that the seller is the person responsible for appointing the attorney. But the problem is that the context of this, and first I'm just giving the origin story, and then I'll jump on to the more practical answer. So from an origin perspective, the courts indicated this, but what sometimes doesn't come to people's attention is the fact that this was indicated by a court because the contract was silent. It didn't specify who the attorney was acting on behalf of. And if you look at most of the cases that relate to this topic, it's normally about money. It's normally about when the money hits the attorney's account, who does it belong to? Does the seller get to appropriate it? Does the purchaser get to appropriate it? Who does the attorney actually act on behalf of? And a lot of the cases pertain to this. There were also cases in KwaZulu-Natal, if I'm not mistaken, that said the opposite, that indicated that it was the purchaser that was actually represented because the purchaser pays a lot of the costs and it's his attorney. There was other cases that said the conveyancers don't actually represent anyone. They're responsible for a certain procedure in law. And this procedure is inconsequential of any one party's wants or desires above the other. They need to make sure that this process of transfer is legitimate, it's verifiable, and it's done correctly as a conveyancer. So there's three different arguments, and all of them hold water because I've had all three. If you look at it now practically, the reality is in the past, it was understandable that a seller felt very uneasy if there was a random attorney handling the transaction because he was giving his property away and now he wanted to receive money for it and he didn't know whether he'd be able to receive that money or not. Now, especially because of things like the Fidelity Fund, the fact that you can very easily verify the credentials of an attorney. Obviously, the amount of transfers that actually take place, that level of security isn't as much of an imperative as it was back in the 1900s. So now it actually becomes a question of the purchaser being able to make sure that, number one, he receives vacant occupation. And if he tells the conveyancer, listen, hold off, something strange is happening here, that the conveyancer listens to him. It's also about the purchaser actually paying the costs and sometimes having a relationship where they can get certain discounts. And the problem that I find sometimes, and this is where the problem is kind of compounded, some estate agents prefer using their conveyancers. And because of this choice, we've had clients that have come to us and said, well, in fact, we've been told that we're not allowed to use anyone else but their agents. I've even had sellers that have come to me and said they're not allowed to pick their own conveyancers because the estate agents carry that right to pick the conveyancers for them. So we also now need to be careful as to how this is being driven, whether it's actually a seller, purchaser, or estate agent right, and how this is being driven the most. And this is something to be careful of. And the answer to this is it's contractual between the seller and the purchaser. The case law doesn't say that the seller has to. The contracts are allowed to be concluded, allowing this to be a negotiable aspect. And it's something that's negotiated in a contract of sale between the two parties. And the purchaser can pick his if the seller is willing to, but there is a norm or an expectation that the seller gets to pick it.
Bruno, I think you touched on something very important and you did it extremely diplomatic. And I think it's very important for our viewers to appreciate this. The estate agent has nothing to do with the transfer process. And I say this while you all know I have very good relationships with the majority of the national agencies. And they know this, we all know this. The reason why the agent is pushing you to a specific attorney, you need to understand why. If it is because that is the attorney that they get the best service from. If you don't have a relationship with an attorney and you don't know where to go and your agent says, go to this attorney, just ask the question, why? And find out if you are actually comfortable with that firm. Because unfortunately, and I'll say this, unfortunately, there are a lot of firms out there that are actually paying estate agents for instructions. Now, that is against the rules of the Law Society. And for some reason, sometimes it just, it's okay, but it's against the rules of the Law Society. And it makes it pretty difficult for us as attorneys that actually stick to the rules and stick to ethical limits of the law to compete with firms that are actually willing to pay a portion of their fee to the estate agent. I actually know, and I won't drop names right now, it's not the forum, but there are big firms that are well-known firms that I know for a fact pay a percentage of the transfer fee to the estate agent. Now, for our estate agent viewers, guys, I know it's nice to get like 2,000-3,000 rand per transaction back into your pocket. You're not entitled to that, and that is actually, the attorney will get struck from the roll. So it's not a nice to have. I don't care how they frame it. I don't care what they say they're paying you for. If they're paying you, unless you are an admitted attorney, you're not allowed to fee share with anybody else. So it's a problem. And definitely, if you are pushed to an attorney, make sure you are comfortable, because you're going to end up having the relationship with that attorney for the entire transfer process. If you don't trust the attorney, you don't know the attorney, you're not comfortable, or you just don't like them, you don't have to be with them. You really don't have to. You can really choose your attorney. And I'll share a little secret. If you are using an attorney and you're not happy with them, you can move. You can end mandate and you can go to an attorney that you are actually comfortable with. Yes, you might end up paying wasted costs, but depending on the reason that you are moving, you can negotiate around the wasted costs that you need to pay. I think it's actually sad, Bruno, that we need to have these conversations, but I suppose that's the case in all professional jobs where people believe they are sort of at the mercy of the person that has to do the job for them. We are actually at our client's mercy. And we are actually the ones that has to jump through all the giving proper service hoops to our clients. So if you're not happy, don't be stuck in a situation where you feel that you're not receiving proper service. That was my little speech. No, I sometimes go into head girl mode, hey, like, cis attorneys
also very diplomatic.
Was it diplomatic? But
it really was. Like, I think we managed to go around the topic without actually pissing anyone off. That's kind of well done.
Well done. Right back at you, sir.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I think it's very important for our viewers to know that as well. And then I just want to quickly go back to the cryptocurrency, because I see we do have a comment from David. He says, how would you issue a guarantee in South African rand from a cryptocurrency account?
That's the problem.
I was thinking the same thing. First of all, I don't think you'd be able to issue a guarantee in rands for starters, right? So you stick to one currency or the other. Now, this I'm not sure of, but I could probably get the answer within a couple of minutes from some of the guys that I know. In fact, by next week, I'll probably have the answer to most of these things. I'm almost entirely sure that certain platforms have been created as escrow accounts, where you're actually able to load cryptocurrency in some kind of pending account until something happens. I'm almost entirely sure, because people have been using cryptocurrencies, and it's the sale of anything. I mean, you could do a sale of immovable property or of movable, where you might not want to give a certain asset away. And especially if you look at the tech environment, you want to make sure that if you're buying something in the tech space, that it's all there, that it makes sense, that it functions. And I mean, this is what cryptocurrency is used for. So I'd have to check, but I'm almost 80%, 90% sure that a escrow platform would exist. I'm just not sure how it would work. But by escrow, I mean that's very similar to how guarantees work. So what happens with attorneys is we receive money, and once the money's in our account, we issue guarantees saying we promise that we have the money, and we promise upon the happening of X, we'll pay it to you. And that's effectively what escrow is. When you listen to the US terminology, it sits in one place, pending certain requirements being fulfilled, and then it gets paid out.
Yes, and I think that's exactly to the point of the very specific offer to purchase, because you won't be able to deliver guarantees in South African rands. It's seriously not going to be possible, because it isn't in rands. So it will have to be a guarantee in whichever currency. It's exactly the one thing that I was like, your purchase price will then have to be in that particular currency. And to your point, if it then ups and downs, you can end up on the wrong side of the up or down, or for that matter, on the right side of it. Matter of faith.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that. And then 2 weeks ago, we discussed, there was a scenario where there was a dispute as to a fixed term lease agreement or whether it was on a month-to-month basis. And the landlord wanted to charge an early cancellation penalty. And I know we said we'll discuss it at a later stage in more detail. So tonight is our opportunity to do that. I don't know, Bruno, do you maybe want to get started on that?
Cool, no worries. So just to refresh memory, there was a lease agreement, and there was a dispute between the parties as to whether the lease was for a full year, a fixed term, or whether it was month to month. The tenants claims it was month to month. The landlord claims that it was the full year, and the reason for this was there was a typographical error in the contract that got the year wrong. So it said 12 months, but then instead of extending for a full year, they got the year wrong, and it only happened to be for 1 month. That's the long and short of it. And now the next question, the next point of this was our client, in this case was the landlord. They were convinced, or they are convinced rather, that they would be entitled to charge an early cancellation penalty. So I don't know, Silna, if you want to maybe just take everyone through what that actually means. What's a early cancellation penalty? How does it apply? The circumstances and all of that.
Yes, that's brilliant. Thanks. So early cancellation penalty comes all the way from Section 14 of the CPA. And what the CPA says is, if you have a fixed term agreement and there is no one natural person in the transaction, Section 14 will apply. And the consumer, being the tenant, is entitled to cancel that fixed term agreement by giving the supplier, in our scenario, the landlord, 20 business days notice of termination of the agreement. But the supplier, the landlord, will then be entitled to claim an early cancellation penalty from the tenant due to this damages that he will suffer because of the early termination of the agreement. Now, there's been a lot of confusion around this. It's interesting, Bruno, next year is already 10 years that the CPA has been in place. Yes, I know. Confusion. Exactly. And this is how old we are, because remember, when we didn't even study this, but now it's already an old piece of legislation. I had to break that news to you. But so it's actually a relatively old piece of legislation already. It's been around for almost 10 years. And still people are confused about this early cancellation penalty. The truth of the matter is, if you say nothing about it in your lease agreement, the landlord is still entitled to claim the actual damages that he suffered. And this comes from the Conventional Penalties Act that says nobody may claim a penalty that is greater than the actual damages suffered. But there's nothing that says, there's legislation that says you must suffer damages and you must deal with it. He's still entitled to it. The reason why we agree to an early cancellation penalty in the lease agreement is simply to avoid arguments and litigation and stuff. The reason why we do this is if the parties initially at inception of the agreement agree that it will be a 1-year lease agreement, and in month 3 the tenant decides to cancel the agreement, the landlord and the tenant already agreed when the lease agreement started that in a case like that, the tenant will pay the landlord, let's call it 2 or 3 months damages. It's easy because then on cancellation, the last date there, you invoice the tenant for the agreed cancellation penalty. He must pay that or you deduct it from the deposit. And if you find a tenant in that time period, you need to refund the tenant prorated because you're not allowed to receive money more than actual damages that you suffered, if that makes sense. But now the problem is people got completely confused. And they are starting to do the weirdest things in lease agreements. I must say, I'm seeing it less, at least, Bruno. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing. I do see it a little less, but still there's a great confusion around early cancellation penalty and what it is and what it should be. There is no one standard. And the reason for this is the time in which you will find a replacement tenant in Cape Town today compared to in Joburg, let's say the north of Joburg, it's going to be very different. In Cape Town, you might currently sit with 2 or 3 months vacancy, where in Joburg, you might fill the place within a month. So it's very different from place to place. But typically, agents, landlords know their space and know their area. And they base the early cancellation penalty on that. I'm personally a fan of being silent on the matter, simply because I can negotiate around a cancellation penalty when we get there. But the reason I can do that is I'm a rental attorney. I've done this for 12 years. I'm quite comfortable negotiating around it. I'm not comfortable for my clients to be silent on the matter, simply because it's easier and it avoids litigation if we agree to a specific early cancellation penalty. That was a very long answer.
No, but it's a good answer, and I suppose the difficulty that we face, and this is one of the issues that a lot of people have. So in this specific instance, the lease agreement said that it could be as little as 2 to as much as 3 months worth of rental as a cancellation penalty, right? So it was a predetermined amount. So this now raises 2 specific issues, which I actually find quite funny, and it's something that I debated over quite a lot, which I'm going to put to you. So the first
Barry, is it you? Who was it who kept on saying that?
My Afrikaans accent is not that great.
I put it to you. You sound like a criminal lawyer. I love it. Put it to me.
So the first thing is now the predetermination of a cancellation penalty versus, so it's a reasonable cancellation penalty versus the Conventional Penalties Act. To a certain degree, these do not coincide with each other, because the one says that you cannot, the Conventional Penalties Act says that you cannot claim a penalty higher than the prejudice. Prejudice, damages, slight difference, but let's say it's the same thing, higher than the prejudice that you already suffered. If it's a predetermined amount, now we need to start looking at that and going, well, how do you determine what's reasonable? Because tomorrow you could have a tenant, or in 4 months, maybe you don't have a tenant. So that's the first thing. The second interesting thing is if you make a determination of a penalty and you say in the agreement, if you cancel early, there's going to be a penalty of 1 month, right? Now, in this particular instance, there's still now an election that needs to be made, either minimum of 2 months or maximum of 3 months. Now, this is a further justification that someone needs to enter into to try and express why they picked 3 months over 2 months and whether that in itself is reasonable and simply acceptable. So in these type of situations, it almost feels like the landlord is going to, it's not as simple as saying, listen, you know what, this is the amount, we walk away from it. You've agreed to it, you've agreed to it. Even if you agree to a fixed amount, it can be disputed. And if you agree to a varying amount, it's definitely going to be disputed on the first scenario and on the fact that why did you pick one over the other. So I don't know what your experience is over like over that specific type of issue.
So what I've seen is the more people communicate, because what actually happens is the tenant will do the early termination notice. Landlord says nothing, agent says nothing. Everybody's like, oh, termination notice, do nothing, ne? And then suddenly, 2 days before the end of the lease agreement is now going to pop up the termination, then suddenly everybody goes into a flat panic and calls us, ne? And then they say, oh, what now? What should I invoice? And I say, have you marketed the property? Have you been able to sort of gauge the market there? Do you have interest? And then everybody says, no, we didn't market. We didn't know we should. Well, you should, because you have an obligation to mitigate your damages. That's very clear from the regulations to the CPA as well. You have an obligation to mitigate your damages. So the moment you receive that early termination notice, you need to get on P24, private property, everything. You need to market your heart out. If you don't, you can't show that you mitigate the damages. Then you definitely can't claim the highest potential penalty that the parties agree to, because now you were just being lazy and that's why you're not finding a tenant. However, if you can show that you've done everything you can to mitigate your damages, you've adjusted the price to be market related, you've advertised everywhere, you've done what you could, and still you had no inquiries on the listing, or you had 5 viewings but nobody is interested, then you can argue that you're going to suffer greater damages than what the penalty actually was. So to take the 3 months or the 4 months, the greater amount, is actually just being very nice. However, if you do nothing, honestly, I can't even see that you would be able to claim any penalty because of the obligation to be able to show that you mitigate your damages. But if you actively attempt to mitigate your damages, you probably will be able to. And 1 or 2 months rental would be more than sufficient. But keep in mind that you have an obligation to refund the exiting tenant if you do find a replacement tenant.
So how I've dealt with, and this was a bit more of a cowboy way of doing it sometimes, but depending on the clients, was factor in a relatively reasonable but larger penalty and almost treat this the same way that we normally treat deposits paid in sale agreements, where we actually say, listen, this is the penalty, but if it turns out that I'm able to do X, I will refund you the money back. And you almost take the stance that this is what you're going to be doing, but then kind of open it up for reasonableness, saying, but we're willing to pay it back to you if it turns out that it's not as bad as it appears. And this kind of puts everyone at bay, and it goes back to that old principle that we always used to use, which was deposit gets retained pending quantification of damages. And it's almost going back to that old principle to say, well, you know what, that's what how we're going to make the determination. But yeah, with some clients, they want that amount predetermined, and they don't care whether it takes them 3 months or 4 months. They want a fixed amount that they know they can pocket. And it is allowed, but then, like Silna said, it has to be reasonable, and you don't always get it right. Sometimes it might be too much, sometimes it might be too little. And it is open for dispute. It's not something that's predetermined and, you know, written in stone.
And I think that's a very important point, because I've seen a lot of people not doing anything. And actually, if you do a letter to the tenant to say, "Lekker, we're fine with you terminating, but just remember, this is the amount that you're going to be liable for." Suddenly the tenant is like, "Oh, yeah, no worries. I'm fine. I'm actually loving the place. Have you seen the view? It's gorgeous. I'm staying put." So communication is key. And I think if there's one thing we've learned from 2020 was actually, please just keep communication between landlord and tenant open, because most of the times we can solve issues without all the drama of courts or tribunal or whatever, by just picking up the phone and saying, "Hello, this is the problem," and we can solve it. Obviously, there are problem matters, but most of the times, if you just remind the tenant of what he's going to be in for, he's suddenly going to enjoy the garden much more.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I think that is about the time that we have this evening. Thank you so much, Sona and Bruno, for your insights and great answers. And then to all our viewers, if you have any topics or questions, please comment on the page or send us an inbox message. Then we'll gladly discuss it next week in our Wednesday webinar. And yes, that's about the time we have. So enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks,
Thank
Marley.
you.
Have a good one.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.